and he usually hyphenates, as in substance, what stands beneath all things. His whole argument for the existence of God is that God has to be necessary, in the sense that being is not, like, it's the precondition for being, and he doesn't define God as a creator necessarily, but he's like, okay, things exist, so that condition of existence is how I will define God, because, like, just existence, existence in and of itself. And he makes a pretty strong argument for this idea, although really he isn't trying to justify an idea of God and more taking the idea of existence and identifying it with God, which is a little easier to kind of swallow in many cases. But one of the things he says, it has to be eternal and self-created. So this comes back to the idea of bornless. Like, that is without beginning, that is necessary in and of itself. And sort of that's his, like, most basic concept of the divine. In terms of actually, like, looking at this in terms of the barbarous names and doing the ritual, what people find usually right away is Crowley makes some interesting additions. He has these little sort of poetic sayings that come after the names. And that different people have different opinions about this. I actually think that they're quite useful to use. They're not part of the traditional text at all. They're interpretations that Crowley added on later. But this is where we have to pay attention to the idea that Crowley's saying, well, you know, I used this ritual this way and this is the result that I got. So, you know, again, historically accurate or not, like, that's what we should be paying more attention to. And I would definitely say that it's important for people to, like, come up with their own interpretations, come up with their own ideas, pack the information in Crowley's stuff into it, certainly. But I think that doing it the traditional way, doing it Crowley's way for a while before we get cute with it is definitely a good idea. This is where we make a distinction between the names, the barbarous names, and, like, the titles that we see there. So, like, there are certain points in the rubric of the rituals that we are addressing different titles and different ideas. You can kind of play with that a little. The names themselves, not so much. And one thing that came up when I was talking about this is the concept of vibration and basically the Golden Dawn system, which is just an opportunity for me to address this in general. The Golden Dawn had these documents called the Z2 documents that they use to invoke spirits. And in this version of these documents, when you're trying to talk to a particular spirit or an angel or whatever, you vibrate the name letter by letter. You structure the ritual around those letters of the name of the spirit that you're trying to deal with. So, like, different stages of the ritual should be connected to different letters of the name and so on and so forth. This kind of comes from something John Dee had, where he's getting instructions how to work with the Enochian tablets. And the Golden Dawn really expanded their idea of the Enochian tablets, and they added, like, zodiacal and elemental attributions to each of the squares and whatnot, and that wasn't in the original text, but is, I think, useful. I think it's useful to look at it like that. But that's part of the reason it connects to these Z2 things, where you're doing it letter by letter. This kind of got, the distinction of doing this kind of got lost when the Golden Dawn was working their version of Enochian magic. So, like, when you do the Enochian calls, they would do it letter by letter in the call as well, where it's actually quite explicit in the text. That's not what you're supposed to be doing when you're doing the Enochian calls and whatnot. So this kind of, like, gets expanded into everything. So there are people who take this, and any time they do any kind of invocation, they're doing a letter by letter sort of expression of the name and vibration of the name, where that's not necessarily as appropriate. And particularly for the barbarous names, you're not really invoking the spirits per se. It's supposed to be read in the way that it's written. It's all good. It is. It has its own sort of music to it, and its own, like, beauty to it that it needs to be allowed to express. And you don't do that when you slow it down and do it letter by letter. And this is something that gets, like, lost in a lot of stuff. So essentially, what I'm saying here is that what the Golden Dawn added was two things, and one was to sort of superimpose the pentagram ritual on top of it, and then to add this vibration characteristic. Whereas normally this ritual would just be done in sort of a prayer-like way, where it's just something that's recited, and there aren't really any specificities in the text of the ritual itself as to, like, the context that it should be happening. And you know, Crowley goes into that in Liber Sumac when he's talking about using it to contact your holy guardian angel. And that's significant, yes, but it's not really what the original thing sort of was. what's required here is a lot of practical experience with the ritual, and a lot of interesting phenomena tend to accompany it. I'm hesitant to like go too deeply into personal experiences, because I feel like if you hear someone talk about what they had happen when they do it, it sort of colors your own experience or whatever, and I'm not trying to put ideas in people's heads. But particularly I found like food and sleep are two things that I didn't need very much when I was doing it on a regular basis, or even on a daily basis. Like, there's definitely reduced capacity in that regard. In a strictly practical sense, I would say that people really need to do it a lot, and this gets lost. It kind of turns into this big thing because Crowley throws so much emphasis on it, like it's such a huge deal to do this ritual, and like it's such a big deal, which it is. Like, it's important, but it's really more important to do it as frequently as possible and regularly as possible. I remember reading, when I was doing research for this, I read a blog post by someone who I won't name, so to be nice, but they had written this big thing about the Bornless invocation and what a big deal it was, and their whole interpretation of it, and blah, blah, blah. And then when you get to the end, you realize, oh, and this was what happened the time that I did it. It's like, what, you did it once? Like, no, like, this is supposed to be a regular thing. Doing this once is not impressive at all, and shouldn't certainly entitle you to write pages and pages about what you think of the ritual. So, like with all of these things, it's regular practice is important, but with this in particular, like I was talking about Crowley doing it in his head when he was in China, on a regular basis. It was like a constant thing. It was almost like a mantra with him to be like doing it over and over and over in his head. And that's sort of like the way that we need to approach this. It's not something that happens. Crowley tells us to invoke often and inflame ourselves in praying and whatnot, and there's too much of a tendency, I think, to emphasize single actions in magic, whereas actually the only real results you get is with consistent pushing and pushing and pushing. So in Crowley's notes on this ritual, he mentions two of the other books in the sort of AA canon as being really important. And one of them is Liber 65, which is the book of the Harcourt Serpent, which is about the adept's relationship with his angel, and it's the sort of HGA-oriented book. So that's important, and since Crowley is telling us we should be doing this ritual to contact our angel, it's obviously significant to look at that. But the one I'd like to emphasize really more is Liber 175, or Liber Sarte, which is his sort of interpretation of Bhakti Yoga. And basically this is the idea of, when it comes to like God worship, this is sort of where Thelema has its space for God worship, or whatever. He has the instructions in his book, is if you're to devote yourself to a particular deity or entity, or even to like nothingness in and of itself. Like, he used an example of like, instead of maybe the image of the god you're trying to devote yourself to, if you're trying to do it like in a Buddhist vein, maybe you would have like an empty shrine and just have it to this blank space or whatever. Like, there's different ways to interpret it. But he has all these rules and restrictions in this book, not specifically, but in terms of like the way to restrict yourself and identify yourself with this deity, and it should really change your life when you're doing this. You should be making all kinds of alterations in like your diet and your sleeping patterns and so on. And it's that disruption that creates the space in your habits and your life for this kind of like unity with this divine image that you're trying to unite yourself with. This is really specifically important to doing the Bornless ritual. Like, experience with this is important. Crowley, one of the things that he adds to the text are a lot of visualizations. He kind of tells you, like to see like the solar phallic line serpent in the south when you're doing it like that, and to visualize that. And particularly, he wants the outpouring of energy to be visualized in colors, and like you should see it. It's something like you're projecting out to the four corners of the earth when you're doing these things in the four corners. And that kind of visualization is something that you can get from astral work, and it's there in astral work. But the astral work doesn't have the sort of self-annihilation or losing yourself in the image that you're kind of pushing yourself towards that it has in Liber Sarte or 175. So experience with that is like an important precondition. And even if you don't necessarily do every single thing on his list to unite yourself with whatever deity or concept or entity that is there, just even doing some of them, or like having that experience, that practical experience and engagement with that idea on that level, really is important precondition to being able to sort of lose yourself and project yourself in this way. This all comes up to the big struggle that happens in what Crowley, because he numbers off the sections. In section G of the ritual, after you've kind of done the four quarters, and you come to do the prayer in the middle, this is the point where he's like, well, this is where the adept has to struggle with the will of the angel. And this is sort of where, and this is an important concept of like struggle and adversarial nature. There's a tendency to kind of like look at the holy guardian angel as like your big brother, or like your buddy, or someone who's going to help you out, which is true in a sense, and particularly in ritual experiences when, you know, you get the name of your angel and the idea of your angel, that becomes your sort of fallback. If shit's going wrong, you've got your guardian angel. Like, that's who you're going to call. You know, like that's, if you need something, that you need to know something, you need to do something, you've got your holy guardian angel. You know, that's who you're going to call. But Crowley himself, like his relationship with IVxx was, certainly he used IVxx in rituals. He would call on IVxx at different times, but IVxx fucked with him constantly, like was causing problems for him constantly, creating obstacles for him, telling him to do shit that he didn't want to do all the time. So this is where the whole like struggling with the will of the angel becomes significant, because the idea is that the holy guardian angel is an entity which kind of knows actually better than us what our direction is and what we're supposed to be doing in life. When we are filled, particularly in our culture, we're filled with all kinds of ideas of things we're supposed to want, or things we're supposed to want to do, or things we're supposed to want to be, that might not actually be in tune with our nature. And that can become highly problematic. And I'm not saying that you get your HGA experience and you suddenly become enlightened to the point where you no longer feel those things. I think that that's not a struggle that ends. It's not like you triumph one day, it's like, yes, I beat social programming and it's now over and I'm never going to have to worry about that shit again. Like, no, it's a non-stop thing, and it's never over. Which is why, like, even after Crowley has his HGA experience, he continues to do this ritual, continues to struggle with the will of his angel, because it's a perpetual motion machine, and it never ends, that sort of conflict. And your angel is the one who can actually tell you when you're fucking up, when you're like going in the wrong direction. And this is sort of the point of that ritual, when everything goes on, which there's supposed to be a sort of exhaustion that happens at this point. The point at which you struggle with the will of your angel, and you just can't struggle anymore, so there's a certain form of submission that happens at that point, and you go along with it. And this comes up a lot in Crowley's writings about his angel. The Wake World in particular, where he figures the angel as his like Prince Charming, and he's the fairy princess, and he's come to rescue him and take him away, and it's this whole like this very like fairyland type story, but it's also very significant in terms of what the actual relationship with the angel is. And one of the most important things in that comes up, and it's been pointed out, that some of the barbarous names have a very satanic quality to them, and they seem to invoke the devil, and there's certain things in the Bornless Ritual that indicate that that is actually the case. So that becomes an issue, and that's something that people argue about on the internet, like, is this a satanic ritual or not? Are we invoking Satan?